the daguerreotype had built into it this huge problem that the object was unique. The object was perfect, precise, sharp as a tack, totally beautiful, fitted in the same cases that miniatures went, and everything about it was wonderful. But if you made a daguerreotype, you only got one, and there was no way to make a second copy. So I talk about the uniqueness of the daguerreotype because we should recognize that that's what ultimately doomed it. It was partly doomed because it was expensive. It was on a piece of metal, and it involved mercury and silver and copper, but it also was doomed because it didn't make duplicates. Fox Talbot figured out a completely different system, and I have to go into some detail of the chemistry of the system because it runs all through photography, the problems of this system. It had been known for many, many years, going back to the middle or even early 18th century, that some silver salts, like silver chloride, darken on exposure to light. Silver salts were used in ceramics, and I think Wedgwood in the 17-something or others noticed that if you left silver out and the sun struck it in the morning, it would be dark, it would turn dark. And they figured out right away that you could put a card over it and expose half of it, and the half that was exposed would turn dark, and the half that wasn't exposed didn't. What happened is that the energy of the light changed the silver chloride to metallic silver. The chloride went off as a gas, and whatever it was, silver and chloride became silver and silver, and it showed a metal deposit. But the difficulty was that this silver chloride, the material that darkened, was insoluble in water or anything else. So there was no way to coat it on a piece of paper. It was this huge problem. People kept thinking if they wanted to make pictures, they wanted them on paper. They knew silver chloride would darken on exposure to light, but they never could figure out how to spread it on a sheet of paper. So silver chloride is like a paste, and there's nothing you can do with it. You can't spread it smoothly, you can't brush it, you can't dissolve it in anything. So Fox Talbot figured out that you could get a piece of paper, and you could coat a piece of paper with a weak gelatin solution, the same gelatin we buy at the grocery store, horses' hooves melted down, basically, bones, coated with a thin gelatin layer in which there was dissolved common salt, sodium chloride. And salt dissolves beautifully in water. You could brush this on a piece of paper or dip the paper in it and dry it. And after it was dried, there was a perfect even coating of salt on the paper. You could then take the piece of paper and brush onto it silver nitrate. And when silver nitrate and salt come in contact, they form silver chloride. And because the salt was coated evenly and held by the binder, the gelatin, the silver chloride coating was smooth and even and bound to the paper. It was really an astonishing discovery. So for Fox Talbot, for the albumen print, the wet plate, all through the whole history of photography on paper, this idea of salting a substrate and then treating it with silver nitrate and making a light-sensitive material was the basis of the photography. So we call Fox Talbot's system salted paper. That's the term we applied to it. He figured out another extraordinary thing in the beginning. He got help with it, but there's a fact you have to understand about silver if you're going to understand photography, and that is that it reacts to light in two completely different ways. It's a miraculous material. From 1840 up until about 1985, let's say, I'm looking at you because you know it better than I do. From 1840 to 1985, every picture recorded was recorded by silver, taking the signal of light from the world. Can I say that? I think I can say it. And only with the advent of digital technology did we start to record this stuff electronically and get away from silver. All the silver companies, all the film companies really were just value-added silver companies. They were silver marketeers. That's what Kodak was and Agfa was. But silver reacts to light in two completely different ways. Silver salts, excuse me. One way it reacts to light is we can get the silver chloride or silver iodide or silver bromide, one of these compounds, and we can expose it to intense short wavelength light, like sunlight, and it will darken automatically. The power of the sun will darken it. There's no need of what we call development. The second way it behaves is we can take a silver salt in exactly the right condition, which is hard to achieve, and we can expose it to very, very faint light, where no visible change takes place, and we can put it in a reducing agent, and we can develop an image. So photography has these two means of making an image, and it's really important to understand it. One is the printed out image from the direct energy of light. The second is the developed image from the latent image being developed afterwards. Fox Talbot began his paper photography by having tiny little cameras with very fast lenses and exposing paper and letting the energy of the light darken the paper. He also would do this by contact printing leaves and things like that, where the light would come and change the silver salt to metallic silver. But then at one point he figured out that he could just expose it for a moment in the camera, say a minute instead of an hour, and the piece of paper would still be blank, but he could develop it and he could get an image from development. This idea of the developed image ended up being the stream of photography and photographic capture from the beginning, from maybe 1845, when Fox Talbot figured out the development, all the way up until the digital technology came along. But photographic printing, everything from Fox Talbot up to 1900, used the other characteristic of silver. It used the characteristic of darkening by light. So we never printed in the darkroom until we got into the 20th century. Instead, we printed in a room with regular light, we coated the paper, we went out, we exposed it to the sun and let the sun do the work. So there was this beautiful, beautiful thing in early photography where light made the image. It was absolutely wonderful, and we didn't have to sit around working in dark rooms. So Fox Talbot's paper process was very rough and very unstable. It was rough because the image was stuck on the paper fibers. It was held on by this thin gelatin coating. And if we look at the two examples here, this is a beautiful, fairly stable one that has retained its color. This is one that's fading around the outside, turning yellow. You can see it at the break. This is one I gave the museum that's completely ruined by fading completely, although all it is yellow. I bought a book in a bookshop in Newport, Rhode Island for $100 called the Art Union Journal. And it's a book that was all about printing technology. It was printed in 1846. And I was excited because I found that roulette and etching in it. And I found different odd pieces of printing in it. And I got it home and went through it, and there's a goddamn Fox Talbot glued into it, right? I couldn't believe it. And it's a Fox Talbot in it because they were interested in printing. Somebody said, hey, there's this guy who's got this new way of making pictures. And they went and bugged him, and he got 5 or 6 negatives and made 20 prints from each and gave them an edition. Didn't wash them very well. They glued them in the book, and this is what happened. So, but it's interesting, isn't it? I got a $5,000 tax deduction for giving this piece of garbage to the museum. It's really pretty interesting. Well, it's because, but it's interesting. It's interesting. It's very, very hard to find a beautiful early paper print. They're very rare. They faded. They're tremendously valuable. You can still go into an antique mall in any city in the country and find a daguerreotype. And the daguerreotype was effectively dead by 1865. So every one you find is a piece of the absolute true cross of photography sitting out there. They haven't faded. They're in perfect condition. They're sharp as a tack. They're usually photographically boring, but they're the origins of the medium. It's really extraordinary that they're available. So the paper photography had huge problems about its resolution and its clarity. You can see the difference here. This blow-up is a 50 times blow-up from the eye of the man in this daguerreotype. I bought this daguerreotype for $10 in a junk shop. This blow-up is from a later print from a paper negative, a negative made in France about 1852. And you can see the image quality is atrocious in this compared to the image quality in this. But it's on paper. Paper's cheap. Paper can get glued into books, so it can go into the book realm, and it exists in multiple copies. So because of this, the paper photography very rapidly killed the daguerreotype on its metal plates. The paper photograph was made by making a paper negative, a salted paper negative, which was processed, washed, dried. After it was dried, it was waxed with heavy wax, and it made the paper translucent so that it could transmit light and it could be used to make a print, a positive print on another piece of paper. So we made a negative, we processed it, waxed it, put it in contact with another piece of identical paper, salted paper, exposed it to sunlight, And in this case, the light translucent parts of the picture were the dark parts in the original part of the world. They were the ones with no light. And they made the dark parts in the print, so we got a positive. So positive negative photography was invented. And I think Herschel named it too. I think Herschel's the one who said, why don't you call the first one the negative and call the second one the positive? So the positive prints had lots of problems. They had to be exposed in sunlight, and then you got an image that you saw in the printing frame. And if you find an old printing frame, you find a hinge in the back. And that's because you can have the negative and the paper together in the frame. You can expose them to the sunlight, take it inside, turn it over, open up one half of the frame, peel the picture back and look and see how far it's gone. And the other half is clamped in the frame, and so you don't lose registration. So that's the reason for the hinge in the back of the printing frame. But then, if we got that exposed print, that beautiful, rich exposed print, and put it in hypo, which was the fixer, Herschel's fixer. I'm looking at him because he's read Herschel's letters. You know, he's read the whole thing, which I never have. If you put it in the hypo, this beautiful, beautiful print turned the color of egg yolk. It turned this awful yellow, this pale yellow, because the hypo, no matter how dilute, attacked the silver. So they figured out early on that they could get the print before it was put in the fixer and put it in a tray of water that had an acidic gold chloride in it. A slightly acidic bath with gold chloride. And the gold would plate itself onto the silver. Not onto the silver chloride, but onto the metallic silver. And then you could put it in the fixer. The role of the fixer was to dissolve the silver chloride, but it wouldn't attack the gold plated or the gold image on the silver. And so you got a perfectly permanent picture. But the worst thing in the world you could put a piece of paper in is hypo, the fixer, because it's a sulfur compound that's tenacious. You can't wash it out of the piece of paper. And so inevitably, any piece of paper you put in this stuff will turn yellow. So all chemical photography is ultimately doomed, no matter how careful you are. Now, maybe the Lee Friedlander on the wall will last 200 years, but ultimately it's doomed too, because of this goddamn hypo. One of the wonderful things in digital photography that we come into is hypo has disappeared. The reason that the daguerreotypes last is the hypo is tenacious to the silver and the copper. It washes right away. So we don't have this residue, this terrible chemical. So, but let's get the process straight, and then we'll pause because we have to move to another corner, or maybe lunch. A piece of paper is salted, sensitized with silver nitrate, dried, put in a camera. An exposure is made, it's taken out of the camera, it's developed, it's fixed, probably toned and then fixed, washed, dried, waxed, put in contact with another piece of paper which has been salted and had silver nitrate brushed on it and dried, exposed directly to the sun, taken out of the frame, put in a bath of water, toned with gold, fixed, washed, dried, and we have the picture. So a whole series of steps. But we still have the negative, and we can make as many of the prints as we want. And the prints might fade, they might be fuzzy, but they're cheap, and we can make as many as we want. And they're on paper, so they're the perfect step to the book, which is what we know it's all really about anyway. And right from the beginning, Fox Talbot, one of the first things he did is to make a book called The Pencil of Nature. So we have a couple of salt prints here. We have a beautiful platinum print, which is a process I'll talk about later, from the salted paper negative. And when we turn around and go to this corner, we're going to go to the next great step in photography, which was the wet plate. But is it time for lunch, do you think, or not? What do you think? Or questions?
I think so. I have a question.
Yeah, questions are better.
I'm interested in, do you think that there's a relationship between what you were talking about in terms of the asphaltum or that is in the apple printing and what Neps did? Do you think that there's
Oh yeah, because I think it was stuff that was around. Oh yeah, absolutely. It was in use. It was in use making actors.
So you
in
think
fact,
that's
I'm sure. I know how it happened. I'm sure of how it happened. When we make a gravure plate, and I've done this a lot, the gravure plate tends to corrode if it's not protected. So after you've made the addition, you print it. It's wonderful. You have to protect it. And you happen to have in the shop the stuff that was the dissolved albumen in turpentine, which is the staging out material. So what we used to do is we used to paint it on the plates. And it's perfect, it protects them perfectly. Then you're going to strip it off when you need the plate again. But if you leave it out in the sun, you can't strip it. and you literally can't strip it without ruining the copper surface. So I'm sure they knew that in the print shops. I'm sure they knew that if you had a plate and you put the stuff on it, light would harden it. And I'm sure Yale said, bingo, I'm going to make a picture with this. So I'm sure that's why it happened. I think technical innovation happens, I don't think anybody has an idea. I think it happens in little steps and people go, oh, and see something and jump on it. So.
Well, I've also heard the story about when you were talking about the daguerreotype and how Daguerre came up with utilizing the vapors of mercury.
Yeah.
It was a true mistake. Hirschhorn talks about it in his book.
Yeah, it must have been a mistake.
He actually was taking, processing a plate, and it would get to a certain development, and then it would stop, so it was really soft and fuzzy. And then he took it and he put it in a cupboard.
Yeah, which had mercury. Yeah.
He went back to it 3 or 4 days later to read.
It makes complete sense.
He opens the door, and there's the picture.
It makes complete
And
sense.
he can't figure out how it happened, so he does it again. He can't do it. He says, well, we'll put it back in the cupboard. He puts it back in the cupboard. It develops in 3 days.
Yeah.
And he discovers a broken thermometer in there.
Yeah, that's great.
What
That's
it
great.
is. That's,
Sure,
that's how the evolution was.
Yeah.
Well, he thought it was the cupboard. Who knows? But I mean, who knows what he said? It's a fantastic story. How it was just a mistake.
It's really interesting.
Right place.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think we have an idea that invention comes out of the mind of somebody, and I've never thought it does at all. And certainly biological evolution doesn't come out of anybody's mind. It goes in these little tiny increments of change. And I think one of the things that our minds do is they look at change, and they see change, and they see something new. And instead of having an idea, we go, oh, and we recognize the thing that's happened. So I think the technical innovation is these little tiny steps.
And it's fascinating to find out that one of the NEPs couldn't repeat that process.
Yes.
I mean, you can only do that one time.
Yeah.
That was it.
That was it.
One picture.
Yeah.
Is that right?
I'm only aware of one. Well, I'm only aware of one that exists.
Right.
Yeah. It's fascinating though. So the multiplicity of paper photography didn't really kill the daguerreotype until the photographic negative came off paper and went onto glass. And that was a great step that happened in the 1850s. There was a man named Scott Archer, an Englishman, I think in 1852, if I'm right about the date. Do you know the date?
Yeah.
I think it's 52. Scott Archer figured out that you could coat a piece of glass with collodion. There's lots of collodion around because it's a byproduct of the manufacture of gunpowder, and everybody was killing each other with guns. You could coat a piece of glass with collodion that had salt in it. Just the same idea of salting that existed in salted paper. And you would pour this salted collodion on the plate and you'd tip it like this and pour the excess off, and very quickly it would set up into a film. A tough, not fully dry, but a film on the surface of the glass. I remember when I was a little kid, my mother had a bottle of collodion, and if I got a minor cut, she would put a little drop on the cut, and it would form a film, and it would seal the cut. So all the time I was a little kid, I never had Band-Aids, I had dribbles of collodion on my fingers. But you could then get this sheet of glass with collodion, and while it was tacky, set tacky, you could then put it into a thing called a silver bath, which was a funny narrow box, usually taller, an inch or two wide. And you put it in a holder, and the silver bath had silver nitrate in it, dissolved in water. And the silver nitrate would immediately react with the salt and make that light-sensitive silver salt embedded in the collodion. I don't think it's silver chloride by this time. I think it's silver iodide, silver bromide. It's all kinds of different silver compounds that are in there. But if you pull it out of the bath and let it drip dry, you could then put this plate in the camera while it was still wet and it was light sensitive. You couldn't let the plate dry, because if you let it dry, the silver would turn into a crystal, and the crystal would disrupt the collodion surface and lose its sensitivity. So this plate had to be coated with the collodion had to set, which only took a minute or two, put in the silver bath, pulled out of the silver bath, drip dry, put in the film holder, and immediately take it out to the camera and expose. You had about 5 to 10 minutes to do the exposure. And then it had to immediately be taken and be developed. And the development also had to be done while it was wet. So in this wet plate era of photography, the photographer had to carry a darkroom around. And we see Timothy O'Sullivan pictures that he made out of the Western landscape, and there in the corner we see a funny little object that's like a tent, and it's where he coated his plates and developed his plates. But the wet plate photograph was incredible because there were no paper fibers disrupting the image, and the image of the lens was perfectly rendered in this collodion coating of glass, the silver deposit. So all of a sudden, the rendition of photography in a negative form matched that of the daguerreotype. This glass plate could then be printed on salted paper to make a print. But even then, the black of the salted paper print was always weak because it was matte surface and there wasn't a heavy silver deposit. So a new way of printing was invented to go along with the wet plate, and that was called the albumen print. And the albumen print differed from the salted paper print in that the binder for a very heavy salt coating was albumen, egg white. And so the albumen print held heavy enough silver deposits so the image could be very dark and strong. But it still had to be exposed by sunlight, and it still had to be toned in gold, and then fixed, and then washed. So let's go through the steps very carefully. We have the paper negative, which is salted paper, and it makes the paper print, which is called the salted paper print. And then Scott Archer figures out how to make this new kind of negative on glass, called the wet plate negative. And that requires a new kind of print, and so the salted paper print is adapted to become the albumen print. So by the time we get into the 1860s, the paper negative has disappeared, Fox Talbot's process has gone away, everything is being done with a wet plate, and everything is being printed on albumen paper. And really, if we look at the 19th century, 95% of all the photographic prints made are wet plate pictures printed on albumen paper. I'm going to talk about all these other weird processes, but we have to remember that albumen from a glass negative was the king. So this was a tremendous transformation, and it was in high gear by the 1860s. And I thought you were asking a question. I thought you were doing a new kind of pointing. Oh, sorry. What happened is that the pictures retained the beautiful purpley brown color that the salted paper print had, but the albumen gave them a semi-gloss surface so they could have a beautiful black value. And we can see that in all these. These are albumens here. This is a really extraordinary one. They curled terribly, so they almost always were glued down on a piece of paper. They curl because if you put a coating of anything on one side of a piece of paper and don't coat the other side, it curls. If you have a set of shelves, if you go off to college and you make your first set of bookshelves and you only paint the bookshelves on the top, they'll warp before you get out of your first year because you've only painted one side. That plagues photography all along. You always have to coat both sides. But the albumen print, if properly washed, could be very, very permanent. They usually had a yellow cast. Every one of these had a bit of a yellow cast. But they made beautiful, beautiful pictures, and the rendition was equal to anything we've had since. Now, one reason the rendition is so good is that the albumen print could only be printed by contact. We have to talk about this idea for a minute, because it hasn't come up yet. Those of us who photograph know that we can go into the dark room, we can have an enlarger, stick a little negative in the enlarger, and project an enlarged image on a piece of paper and get a print. That wasn't true in the 19th century. In the 19th century, all the processes we had of making a print required such intense illumination that it couldn't be passed through an enlarging lens. If we passed it through an enlarging lens, it would be so much light it would destroy the negative. So that all photographic printing in the 19th century, I say all, it's not quite true, but almost true, was made by having a negative that was going to be the size of the picture, and the negative was placed in contact with the sensitive paper and exposed directly to sunlight. Yes?
How important was the quality of the glass, and where was that developed?
It wasn't too important, and a lot of the early glass negatives had bubbles and things in them. But because the glass is in contact, all it's doing is holding the coating.
That's all it's doing?
No, the two coatings are in contact with each other. So a bubble would just show us a little defect, but it didn't have to be a really good sheet of glass. But so if we look at this Frith picture, we have to recognize that Frith, out in the desert, coated a glass plate that size. And he coated it perfectly. And he exposed it wet, and processed it wet out there in the desert. It's really unbelievable. The print did not have to be made then. But if we also look at the picture, we can tell that some hanky-panky is going along with the edges of the horizon of the stones and the pyramid. And the hanky-panky is that when the coatings had problems, they always had the problems in the skies. But the skies were big, even areas of tone. And the wet plate was only sensitive to blue light, so the skies were grossly overexposed. So it was very, very difficult to have the sky in a picture be decent. And so almost always the photographer later on would paint the skies out. So the skies become blank. And this is a classic example of the blank painted out sky in a picture with the albumen print sitting at the bottom. So the albumen print went along, and it was very happy, and it dominated photography. Toward the end of the 19th century, some people stopped using albumen and started using gelatin to hold the salt instead of albumen. So there's a funny period in there where you start to get these things that look like albumen prints, but they're really gelatin prints. The albumen is called a POP print, printing out paper print, because the sunlight made it directly. So we can call these albumen POPs, but when we get to these pictures, they're gelatin POPs. Gelatin is the binder. This idea of a printing out paper was completely killed by the dry plate, which we'll get to in room 3. The dry plate came along in the 1880s, dominated photography from 1900 on, but the albumen print and then the gelatin POP really continued to be made, and they were still around when I was a kid. And they were around because portrait photographers could make pictures of you in the studio, and they could get a box of POP paper, and they could expose the prints to an arc lamp in the studio. You could take them home, pick the one you liked, but they weren't toned and fixed, and they would turn black. So you had to come back to get the finished portrait. So even when I started photography in the 60s, I could go buy a box of gelatin POP paper and use it to make a print. And here we find Judith Joy Ross doing the very same thing, still to this day, photographing with the paper. Peter, where does she get the paper now, do you suppose? Because Kodak doesn't make it anymore, right?
That's an interesting question.
I think it's made in France. I think Kodak has stopped, but somebody in France is still making it.
Chicago albumen works still making it.
Oh, in Chicago Albumen Works, that's right, which is a company that refigured out albumen printing to make prints for the Museum of Modern Art. You know? So we're gonna move into the dry plate. We're gonna move into other photographic printing processes, but you should realize that the albumen print completely dominated photography in the 19th century. It was killed by the wet plate at the turn of the century, but it had a little residue in these gold-toned gelatin printing out papers that went into the 20th century that still exist today. Now, after lunch, we're going to spend time in this corner because there are a whole bunch of photographic printing processes that did not use silver. And I said a little while ago that every picture that was taken from the invention of photography until the invention of digital technology was taken with silver. That was the capturing system, but there were lots of funny printing processes that didn't use silver. And some were based on iron, some were based on gelatin and other materials hardening from exposure to light. They couldn't be used for capturing the image because they required too much light to go through a camera, but they could be used printed by contact with sunlight. So we will deal with those after lunch before we go into the period of the dry plate when everything really goes to hell.
Sure, one of the, you may want to.
Oh, I'll talk about these when we come back. Yes, I'll talk about those after lunch. Thank you, Josh. I would have left them out. The tintype is not a bad thing to leave out. We're just going to spend a minute in this corner because Jock very sweetly pointed out that I forgot the tintype, which would be a terrible thing to do. And then we're going to go to this extremely interesting corner of pigment prints. So the tintype is a very odd creature, and it came along sort of mid-19th century, maybe the 1860s, 70s, and it persists to today. And in some places in South America, you can still go get a tintype if you're a tourist walking around in Machu Picchu or something. Have you bumped into the mountain? Found people making them? Because I think they still do. But the tintype is very interesting. It is a wet plate negative made on a black support. And it's a fascinating idea. If you take a wet plate negative, and instead of coating it on glass, you coat it on a piece of blackened metal, say something that's got a Japan black paint on it, and you develop it, and then you develop it in, I think, potassium cyanide, which makes the image quite gray. The gray of the silver deposit is lighter than the black support, so it turns into an instant positive. It's as though tones go from bright white to black, and with the tintype, they decide that the highlight's going to be a middle gray, and the whole picture is going to exist between middle gray and black. So they can be made in different ways. One of them, which is quite cute, is called an ambrotype. Watch me ruin Will's life by doing this. And this is these two are ambrotypes here, and I've taken this one apart, and it's a wet plate negative on glass, and it's been painted black in the back. And the black backing makes it look like a positive. And I've scraped it off half. I've murdered this poor ambrotype. And if you look at it, you can see that the right half is simply a negative. Left half looks like a positive. The tintypes are very, very inexpensive because they don't involve lots of silver, like the daguerreotype, the silver plating on the copper, they're on a cheap piece of steel. They can be made very quickly because they don't have paper, so you can fix and wash them very, very rapidly, and they're clean, they don't deteriorate. They're awfully dull and dark. This one on the right is a new one made by a photographer named Nick Gibbons. It's as good as they get, technically. It's beautiful, beautiful tintype, but even so, the highlight is really a middle gray. Most tintypes are little. 90% of them are anonymous portraits. We have no idea who they're of or who made them. You can find them in junk shops for $1 a piece. There are thousands of them all over the place. They were occasionally put in cases, like the daguerreotype, but usually they're just a little paper folder, a cheap lithograph paper folder. You have to be very careful if you go to antique malls and junk shops, because often people will put a tintype in a daguerreotype case and call it a daguerreotype. The daguerreotype is literally a mirror surface, a shimmering mirror surface. The tintype is a dull, gray-black object. This pair up here are an absolute glory, the couple, and I found them in a junk shop in Bridgeton, Maine. And I bought her for $7.45 because she was unframed. I had to pay $35 for him because he was still in his frame. But those are quite rare. Those are whole plate tintypes. This idea we have about the 4x5 camera and the 8x10 camera is a new idea. The whole plate used to be 6.5, 8.5. And so if you have a 6.5, 8.5 cut in half, it's a half plate. Cut in quarters, it's a quarter. So there's a whole terminology of plate size. Every once in a while, I'll have a student come running up to me and say, oh, I found the most beautiful 8x10 camera for $30 in a junk shop. And they'll pull out a 6.5, 8.5 with a camera. You can't get plates for them anymore. They're long gone, so there's still some of them around. Some will walk around. His first pictures are 6.5, 8.5. His tin relic and his Saratoga Springs are glass in that format. So the tintype was a funny little thing. It was a picture for the common masses. It was unique like the daguerreotype. It looked like hell, but it was very permanent and very cheap. And there's hundreds and hundreds of them still around. It's a little bywater in photography, and it never quite disappeared.